Hey folks, welcome to this two-part series on making brushes in Procreate. Brushes are a really powerful way to add personality, style and texture to your artwork. While there are loads of brush packs available to download or buy, like mine on my Patreon, understanding how they work, modifying them to suit your needs, and making your own is such a great skill for a digital artist to have. In this first tutorial, we're going to go over the basics of making a simple brush and get into the process a little bit. Next time, we'll look at more complex settings and how to make some really wacky mixer brushes. But for now, we're going to go over the theory of how the Procreate brush system works and how you can make your own textured oil painting brush. So let's jump into the theory. This is a really simple overview, and I won't bore you too much because the Procreate manual that's linked in the description has an in-depth description of every single slider in the menus. Really simply, Procreate uses two images to make a brush, a shape and a grain file. These images are black and white and use the values from black to white as opacity, with black being 0% and white being 100% opaque. Procreate uses a shapefile to describe the shape of the brush stamp. The grain is then masked by this shape and gives the brush texture. Not every brush uses a special grain file. For example, the round brush is just a shapefile with solid fill. This grain can be set to either moving or texturized. Moving the texture smears the texture of the canvas as you draw, whereas texturized brushes reveal it like a mask. Now that we understand the basic concepts of how shape and grain files are used in the brush engine, we can jump in and make one together. Okay, so let's get started with our brush engine. So to open the brushes, tap the icon up here and you'll have your brush selections on the left and your individual brushes on the right. So we're going to tap a brush, round brush, and it brings up the studio for the brush. On the left side you have the category panels showing all of the different properties you can change. The middle panel shows the properties specific to that category, and the right panel shows the drawing pad, which updates live with different settings changes. You can change the drawing pad's colours and whether it's in a 3D preview or not. We're not going to do that today, it's just going to be a nice simple tutorial. So I would really recommend playing with all of these things before you start messing around with making your own brushes, just so that you can see, what you want to do before you start doing it. If you go in here blank, you might end up spending a few hours and not really getting anywhere. So go in with a bit of a goal and you'll come out the other side hopefully with something in mind. If you don't want to mess a brush that already exists up, you can create a duplicate by right swiping and hitting duplicate. Now I've got a duplicated exact copy of that brush, but I can really change a lot of the things and not worry that I'm going to mess it up. So yeah, make a silly brush like that. So we're going to delete that, we're going to make something from scratch. So if you hit the plus icon in the top right, we get a basic round brush to start with. Now I want to make an oil brush, so the first thing I'm going to do is change the shape. Hit the shape file, and go into edit up here, we can import a new file. So I've already made one, so import from file and go into here. The source library is a really good place to look for these. They've included loads and loads of different shapes that you can use for yourself. So if you want to look for something, start here before you start making your own. I'm pretty familiar with it, and I knew they didn't have exactly what I wanted, so I made my own. So I click done, perfect. The drawing pad updates and we can see already it looks a little bit more traditional. Now, it looks a little bit too uniform for me, so I'm going to add a little bit of scatter, not too much. Very small percentage changes can have a big effect on brushes. Subtle is always better for more traditional looking stuff, because you're not going to really make that much of a wacky real life brush. So yeah, keep that in mind. Small changes are really important. I'm going to leave the rotation off, but if you swipe all the way right to the rotation, it's going to follow your stroke and create this sort of cool following trail effect. As I say, I'm going to leave that at 0 for now. I'm quite happy with this looking the way it does, so perfect. Now that we have a shape that looks traditional, we're going to change the grain. At the moment it's this flat grain texture and it doesn't look very realistic. Looks a little bit too fake. So again, we'll import a new file, and we've already made one called the grain. Perfect. So let's click done there. Boom. We have a new file and a new drawing pad, and everything's starting to come together. So at this point, we're just going to go click done. It's an untitled brush still. Let's clear the canvas and see how this looks. So we'll just do a few brush strokes, see how things are looking. It's kind of okay. I think we can change a few things. Part of the brush making process is just changing it, testing it, changing it, testing it. It's sort of back and forth of doing that. What I don't like is how the stroke path is a little bit too far apart at the moment. So we're just going to bring that into about 6%. 5, okay. We'll try that again. Much more solid now, yeah, that's perfect. So we can still see the grain of the canvas there through, but if we press really hard, it's going to cover it just like real paint would. Good. I think the grain could come through a little bit more. So we're going to go into the grain and change the contrast and the brightness so that it impacts the saturation a little bit more. So if we increase the contrast and decrease the brightness, you can see it's going to change how much paint is put down. So let's try this again. That's looking a lot more realistic now. Looks like we're sort of bringing paint over a canvas, and if we want to cover it, we'll have to do a few strokes, just like a real paintbrush would. Perfect. So now that we've got the shape and the texture down, we're going to change a few other settings to make this look a lot more realistic. For those settings, they're going to be colored. So let's pick a color and change. There we are. Yeah. We're going to go into the color dynamics setting here. So color dynamics is really cool, and it changes the color of the brush stroke or the stamp within the brush stroke so that we can make things look a little bit less uniform and maybe a little bit more chaotic and realistic. Like real paint isn't going to be completely saturated perfectly the same the entire time. As you mix it on the canvas and as you use different mixes and things, the pigments are going to get less saturated or more saturated depending on the situation. So creating a little bit of random hue variation within the stroke, I feel, creates a lot more realistic looking brushes. So the stamp and the stroke can have different changes. If we just change the stroke path spacing a bit, you can see that it's made of individual stamps here. So those individual stamps can each be a different color. So let's just bring it back down and go back into our color dynamics. And as you change the hue here, you can see it really gets wacky. You can end up with just entirely rainbow looking brushes. Now, I don't think that's how I want it to look. So what I'm going to do is change the hue of the stroke color. And that means per stroke, per time I put my pencil down onto the screen, it's going to give it a tiny bit different color. And we're only going to change that about 3 or 4%. I don't want it going too different each time because I like to choose my colors very specifically, but just having a tiny bit of color variation as well as lightness and darkness variation is going to just make it that little bit more realistic looking. So now that we've got the colors and the textures looking right, I just want to make sure that the brush acts a bit more like a paintbrush with bristles would. So if we go down to the Apple Pencil settings here and change the size for pressure. Now as you push down on a paintbrush, the bristles spread out a little bit more and we'll get a bigger stamp of the brush. So with the pressure of size slider, we're going to change that just a bit to about 40%. And as I press lighter, it's going to be smaller, and heavier is going to be bigger. I like using that because it's going to add a little bit more sort of realistic reaction to my brush strokes. And again, I'm going to turn down the opacity. With real paint, it's very difficult to control the opacity with your pressure. That comes down to more like application and controlling the pigment. So we're not going to use much opacity. So I'm going to turn that down to 20%. and test that now. So let's pick a colour here. Yeah, there we go. I think that's looking good. Now, I think it might be a little bit too uniform still. So we're going to change the uniformity again. We'll open it, tap on it, go into the stroke path and add a tiniest bit of jitter. Just a 3%, 4% jitter. And let's try that. Yeah, I think that looks a lot more realistic now. Perfect. So now that we've got a more realistic looking brush, I think it's time we name it and give it a bit of information. So if we click on About This Brush, we can see all of the information, this sort of metadata to do with the brush. So we're going to name it, and let's call it Eddie's Oil Painter. Made by me. And we can give it a nice signature too. That's brilliant because now we can own this brush. I like doing this for every brush I make because it feels like it's mine. As I say, I think making brushes as a digital artist is kind of important for your own identity. Now, I'm not saying you have to make every single brush you use. I've got loads, like Greg Rutkowski's brush set here, I use all of the time. But I know how to manipulate these brushes. None of these are exactly how I downloaded them. So, modifying them to suit my own needs is a really powerful way of making my artwork more my own. So once you've got to this place, I think it's good to just spend maybe an hour drawing things, painting them, seeing how the brush reacts, and seeing if you actually want to keep it or not. So you can change the settings and just play with it. Now, I really, really want you to do this because I feel like people are intimidated by making brushes. It's something that they feel is out of their reach and too complicated, and they just want to draw. And as I say, I think making brushes is a really important part of your digital art process. So if you can start doing it, you're going to start making your own brushes and you're going to define your own style with it. Obviously, none of these brushes are going to turn you into an amazing painter. They're all as powerful as the artist, but I think understanding how your tools work makes you appreciate the process a lot more as well. Hopefully that helped. If you have any questions at all, hit me up on the comments section or on Twitter and give me your thoughts. Thanks very much for joining me. Next time, we're going to make some really cool mixer brushes with, like this, 2 different brushes mixed together. So that's going to be really interesting to see what we get. Have a great week, guys, and I'll speak to you. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, leaving a like is massive for small channels like mine. Subscribing is even better. Videos like this are made possible through the support of my amazing patrons. If you would like to join my Patreon, there's a link for that in the description. There, you can access early videos, behind-the-scenes content, and access special loot like brushes and prints. Thanks a lot, Eddie.